We're going to kick off. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your wonderful care of us. Thank you that you watch over our lives, and thank you that you watch over the lives of these people we're reading about. Thank you that there is a deep ambiguity in their life as there is in ours, and we want to praise you that you're a God who sustains and stays in relationship and accommodates and moves with your people, and still your purposes are worked out, and still their wickedness is seen, and still their good things are shown. All these things we read about, and we want to bless your name today. Amen. You might think that's a rather strange and unusual prayer, but I'm about to take you into unknown places. It might be Ian just telling me something. Can I bring home Mounson's grammar? I can, Jan. 2 Samuel 4, and we have Mephibosheth means he who scatters shame. The man who from the mouth comes shame.
So when these people were given their names, like they have these meanings, so they decided to give these newborn babies those names with those meanings? Like how?
Yeah.
That's a very good question.
Yeah. Why do they do that when they don't even know the child? I mean, not that you know the child when you name it anyway, but just sort of.
Or they just knew from the Lord that, boom, this is the name.
It asks the question, what's in a name? That's a quotation from C.J. Dennis. Like, what's in a name, she says. Truth, I don't know. Billow is just as good as Romeo or Julia or Juliet. He loves her yet. If she's the tart he wants, then she's his queen. Names never count. But I like Doreen.
Is this being recorded?
It's neither here nor there. We've already seen in a place called, do you remember when the ark was taken by the Philistines? One of Eli's sons' wives was giving birth, and she called the name of the child Ichabod, which is the glory has departed. So sometimes children are given names which commemorate an event within the history of God's people. That's a good example. Other times they express something which is currently the word of God at their time, like Isaiah's children, Mahashal al-Hashbaz, speed the prey and spoil and speed the booty or whatever. And in that respect, so sometimes these names are more historic than they are people. Sometimes names are given because they are things that God has done, with the person. Example, Israel, his name was changed from Jacob to Israel. He has wrestled with God. He's a prince of God. That's about what it means. And after he wrestled with him. And so sometimes names are like Isaac, Yitzhak, he laughed. Which isn't he laughed actually, it's she laughed, because his mum laughed when the angel said you're going to have a child. And she said, I'm mid-80s or whatever, and she laughed. And he said, and then the angel said, you laughed. She said, I didn't. She said, yes, you did. So when the child was born, they called him Yitzhak, Isaac, which means she laughed. What would it be like to be a child who was named She Laughed? Well, actually, the name is the person, and the occasion is commemorated in the name. So you have both those. You have an historical thing being registered, and you have a person who is known by that name. And just as it is with us, names, very few of us know the meaning of our names, because they're our cipher, they're our label, they're our identity to our friends and neighbours and family. But none of us would really think a lot about what your name means until people become commercial and want to tell you that for a fee. But apart from that, so names have always got a double thrust. They're always the person we know, and sometimes they fit into a story. And in this case, the story is what's decisive here. And now, did Mephibosheth get his name from his place in the story, or did he just have his name? And it happens to mean that. Well, sometimes names get changed, and sometimes they are expressive of an event or a situation.
You mean Mephibosheth or this guy?
Mephibosheth, his name...
Ishbosheth.
Ishbosheth, or both, that Bosheth ending is with reference to shame. So Ish is the Hebrew word for a man. So Ishbosheth is a man of shame. Mephibosheth is of a mouth of shame. Someone who speaks perhaps shameful things. So I don't know the answer to your question about these names, but that's what they mean. Well, it's not what they mean. That's how they come about sometimes, and that's true about places and stories as well. If you study the history of England, then there are people called the Harlings, let's say, and the Harlings live initially around a village which is called a tun, T-U-N in the ancient Old English. So Harlington becomes the place of the Harlings. And there are all sorts of these. There's lots of these little endings in British studies which actually usually mean a little town or a small village or a fen or whatever. And so sometimes you take your name, well, the Harlings are called the Harlings, but the town is called Harlington. And in that respect you think, oh right, so if anything ends in T-O-N in English and it's a town, it'll be the place of those people in the initial thing. So sometimes places are named by virtue of people, sometimes people are named by virtue of place, sometimes by race, and so on. Sometimes usually by their mums and dads. So MacDonald, son of Donald. Patrick, Fitzpatrick is the Norse version in the island of son of Patrick. So Fitzpatrick, all those sorts of combos come like that. So sometimes they just designate you. Oh, that's Donald's son. It's Ronald MacDonald. So you get that sort of... And you see the same thing here.
And yet this guy would have been free to live a life of honour and...
Yes, he would have. His name wouldn't fix him.
Yes.
No. Sometimes your names do fix you a good deal. But for us, I mean, as Australians, we have names that we avoid. But because they've got a bad connotation, perhaps. But in this case, we're not told. But we are told in verse 4, well, let's read it to see where your question, would go. When Ishbosheth, Saul's son, heard that Abner had died in Hebron, you remember Abner died because he was murdered by Joab. He lost courage, and all Israel was disturbed. Now, no wonder Ishbosheth loses courage. This is his major general. And what we've already discovered is the general has actually established the king, not the other way around. It's not that the king has honoured a man by making him a general. The general is so well known that he's actually made the king. And so Saul's son had two men who were commanders of bands. The name of one was Baanah and the name of the other Rechab, sons of Rimmon and the Beerothite, and of the sons of Benjamin, for Beeroth is also considered part of Benjamin. So there's an example. He's a Beerothite because he comes from Beeroth. And the Beeroth fled to Gittaim and have been aliens there until this day. So our writer, who is writing at a later date, is actually raising that. He's giving you a location for his readers, in much the same way that Mark's Gospel translates all the local geographical Palestinian places and the coinage and what things mean in Aramaic. He quotes that for his Roman audience. So you have here. So this is what tells you that 2 Samuel is written for an audience other than, of course, simply a record. So this is not an annal which is recording. This is interpreted history. which tells you that history's already been interpreted before you and I read it to interpret it. When you come to interpret the Bible, much of the Bible is already interpreted. You and I read St. Paul, as we will later on tonight, to actually understand St. Paul, but he himself is an interpretation of the gospel. And we're already reading an interpretation of an interpretation. And when you read a translation in your own version, it's the same. Anyway, it's an aside. Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son crippled in his feet. And he was 5 years old when the report of Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him and he up and fled. And it happened that in her hurry to flee, he fell and became lame. His name was Mephibosheth. So we've been introduced to two men whose names end in Bosheth. So the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, Rechab and Baanah, departed and came to the house of Ishbosheth in the heat of the day while he was taking his midday rest. They came to the middle of the house as if to get wheat, and they struck him in the belly. And Rechab and Baanah, his brother, escaped. When they came into the house, as he was lying on his bed in his bedroom, they struck him and killed him and beheaded him. They took his head and travelled by way of the Arabah all night. Then they brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, "Behold, the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. Thus the Lord has given my lord the king vengeance this day on Saul and his descendants." Now we've already, we just see that David's reign is constantly caught up by these ambitious and self-serving people who actually want to do things. They think they always presume to know what he wants, and of course, whenever you do that, you usually give people what you want, and that's just true. And now David is faced with this terrible thing that Saul's son has been killed, and been killed on the basis that this would surely be a good thing for himself. And he's saying, and he does the thing that kings do. He makes a judgment. He answered Rechab and Baanah his brother, and said to them, "As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from all distress," and I take it he means under Saul even, "when one told me, saying, 'Behold, Saul is dead,' and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him in Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more, when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house, on his bed, shall I not now require his blood from your hand and destroy you from the earth?" And David commanded the young men, and they killed them and cut off their hands and feet, hung them upside down, hang them up beside the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the grave of Abner in Hebron. So once again, David has a funeral. He has to bury somebody. Now this chapter raises for us, I think, some very significant questions which we're going to have to face whenever we read the Old and the New Testament, for that matter. To do that, I've prepared something which I did a long time ago in 2008, but it's an outline of history as we ourselves. There's two there, right? And there's one there, right? And let's just pass them around to the end. But what we've got here is that, just keep this into your hands. You've probably seen this diagram before, but it's an important diagram for a number of reasons. What I was doing at the time was I was preparing people to read the Gospels, and I did a study of covenant. And you'll notice that I've actually used my normal diagram on the right hand up there. I've actually used this in this particular way. And what I've tried to show is that I'm looking at all the covenants that God has made. Actually, there's not all covenants, it's one really. But it's a covenant with Noah in the context of Genesis 1 to 7, a covenant with Abram after the pattern of redemption from 3:11. So after Babel there's a disaster, then God's answer to Babel is really Abram. And if you studied some of God's thinking and God's person, you would have said, well, and I'll put that up roughly on a board there, that he began it all. and then by the time we get to Babel, he's starting all over again. And he has to not rub it out, although the flood is very close to a rub out, but there are some people saved. And then what you find is he covenanted with Abram, Isaac, Jacob and Joseph, the forefathers, and God's covenant is sustained there, and that's what you're reading here. And the covenant of God, wasn't it, to Abram was, you go to a place that I will show you, and I will bless you, and I will give you land, blessing and seed. I'll make your number like the sand of the seashore. You'll be the father of many nations. You'll have oodles and oodles of descendants. And further than that, I will give you a land. And then you discover at the Exodus, the people are in slavery and they're crying out to God in Egypt. And God answers them, and he rescues them and delivers them. And then he remembers them. But then he takes them, and I've listed 10 points of the covenant at Mount Sinai. And I'm demonstrating something here to show you that the idea of what God had given is beginning to morph and change and to adapt and accommodate to the situation. So here in verse 1, in the covenant Sinai at the Exodus, God, Yahweh, is their own possession, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. They are God's possession. There's a relation between covenant and law, which is, this is how I want you to live if you're my people. There are 10 words, the 10 commandments we would call them, and ordinances, lots of things to do about all sorts of amazing situations. If you've got a boil, if you've got a rash on your skin, from things to if you've handled a dead body, if you've done just so many things like that. The covenant is relational. It's a marriage, if you like, and we see the Son of God. We also see the idea of a kinsman redeemer. We see that God is a shepherd warrior person. He cares for his people, but he's prepared to go to war, and he takes on Pharaoh. We find that he gives Pharaoh lots of time to change his mind, which he does, and then goes back on it, and then we find that God just rolls him over with mighty power. We find that at the same time he's really also dealing with the gods of Egypt, for all those plagues shoot at a particular god. We notice that there's worship, but it's worship of the tabernacle, where God is coming in a tent and living among his people, and there's a Shekinah glory of the cloud and the light. God is present, but not really knowable. The tabernacle is not a thing that no one gets into the Holy of Holies and gets to be where God is, as it were. And when the covenant fractures, God, in his steadfast love, picks them up. And Moses is a mediatorial person because they can't stand dealing with God direct, so he pops Moses in the middle, and sin is dealt with by sacrifice. They'd be 10 points of the covenant of the Exodus, which would be helpful. And then it's renewed before the entry into Canaan. And it's recollected by Moses. You appreciate that Deuteronomy, the second giving of the law, is really 3 speeches of Moses. And the whole idea of the legal right to enter, inheritance, the whole idea that the people that they're about to dispossess have come to the judgment of God, and he said it's time for you to be rolled away and to lose your land. And then there's a theology of rest, which is given, that Canaan is to enter a rest. It's as if Eden is recaptured. It's a free gift and it's all prepared. Now what you're noticing is, if you're astute to this, is that what I've listed are really responses of God partly to people's situation. If they're wicked, well then they need to learn certain things and God disciplines them, but he also loves them and he cares for them. On the other hand, if you said, is this God's mind for them? You'd say, yes, it is in their current circumstance, which isn't always very nice. That is, the lives of the Jewish people are fairly ambiguous. They don't stay steady. They turn away, they rebel, they fall into sin, they go after other gods. All the way through the wilderness, we're told by Amos, they were worshipping the star gods. You think, what is going on here? And the answer is that what we're seeing in the Old Testament is a meeting place between a holy God and his unholy people, and how he moulds and moves things and actually makes all things work together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. The whole idea of Old Testament history is it's very ambiguous. Things happen. People have more wives than one. So if you said to yourself, if we look back on the Old Testament and ask the question, are these people morally very good? I mean, are they given to us as moral examples? The answer is not at all. David is a man after God's own heart. But if you mean by that he's not immoral, the answer is he's dreadfully so. So what did it mean then? Well, it meant that he actually did what the judges were supposed to do, which was kill Philistines, and he did that stunningly well and established the kingdom. So you have to ask, what's going on here? And this is particularly where we see these sorts of things happening. Under Joshua and Judges, there's a constant breaching of the covenant, and so there are heroes who save and govern. Under Samuel, there is, hello, hello, a request for a king. You haven't heard about kings up to this point, except foreign kings. And God's people are nothing like them. And what we've seen is, under David, covenant and kingdom now come together as two major themes. As a sanctuary and kingship are brought together, there is choice, authorisation and empowerment. But you see that with Saul, the anointing of David and Saul. Then there's centralisation of worship. We're about to see that come. Then there's rest from Philistines, because David finishes it up and makes the place secure and establishes the borders of Israel as they've never been established to this day again. David's kingdom was extraordinarily large. And then the Son of God as a co-regent, ruling with God. You'll see that in 2 Samuel 7. We're 3 chapters away from that. And what we'll see is that there is a Zion theology, because David takes Jerusalem. Jebus, he takes that fortress, and then the Jebusites are ousted. David takes it. It becomes the city of David, but then it becomes Zion, Mount Zion, where God is pleased to dwell, because he moves the tabernacle and the ark, although they're in different places right now, to these particular places. And you think, oh right, so do we talk Zion language after David? We do. Is God the God of Zion? Yes. That means he's the God of David's fortress, does it? Yes. So what's happening? Well, what's happening is that through these ambiguities that we're looking at in 2 Samuel 4, where people kill heads and David says, I didn't want that, and he distances himself from it, what we're finding is that our Old Testament heroes are not heroes. They're actually bumblers and messer-uppers like we are. And that's quite important, because the story of the Old Testament is about these constant, recalcitrant, difficult people who, in relationship to God, act out for good or ill, faithfully or not, and then God accommodates and still gets his purposes running over 2 millennia. From Abraham to the Maccabees, about 2,000 years. And then comes Jesus. And in 60 years, from AD 0, AD 6 to AD 68, to think of when Paul dies, well then you'd say to yourself, that's the Christian gospel. But just towards that, like we're reading tonight, you start to see, are the Christian churches really nice? Not really. The Corinthians have got a stunning mess running. We see the gospel under Luke's revelation go right across the eastern seaboard, right into Asia Minor, into Greece, into Rome, and if we can understand it, if Paul did it after his first imprisonment, to Spain, then back again into Crete, to Timothy, and then a whole lot of things, yeah? And then suddenly, they're gone. There's no churches there now. Churches of the Middle East are pretty finished. Then the church went into Europe, and Europe is now post-Christian. France, Spain. What we're watching then is, and we're watching the demise of Christianity in the United States. We're watching a major post-Christian religion in Islam come up for the second time. Stopped at an astonishing battle in the middle of Spain in the 7th century, but now almost worldwide and growing and understanding its mission is that. And if you said, and the church has got a history of, if you do your church history and study it, you'd say to yourself, Christians have killed each other constantly over doctrine, they've murdered each other in enormous places, not just in Ireland, but in every place. And if you said, is the church history rather checkered and ambiguous? Is it rather nice? Are you impressed with the church? Not much. Are you impressed with the Jews in the Old Testament? Not much. So what's happening? Because the church has been around now for 2,000 years, as long as Abram to Maccabees. But our scriptures don't include those stories, whereas the Old Testament does. The Old Testament has an understanding. That's why we read the Old Testament. Because the Old Testament will teach you, are these people very compromised? They are. Your church history will teach you, are we as Christians very compromised? Indeed we are. Are we living in days where we think that we're extremely compromised, particularly in a wealthy Christian West? The answer is the gospel always falls over in those places, as it did in the Northern Kingdom, as we shall see under Amos, and Hosea and Micah in the 8th century. So what are we seeing here? I'm raising a question. And what I'm raising is the question here shows that can you discern God's program? Well, no. Yes. Yes and no. Yes, you do see God's program, but you see it in the context of recalcitrant people who actually seem to force him to accommodate. Because we keep falling over, as the Jews do. And the Jewish people are a classic record of people who were covenant people who just kept falling over. And we are a covenant people who keep falling over. Now that's with reference to us as a people. But have there been stunning Christians? Indeed. Have there been stunning Jews? Indeed. Are there Jewish heroes in the middle of this Old Testament which are just people of great holiness and kindness and wondrous faithfulness to God? The prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Are these men unusual and strange men, but strange because they're good? And you'd say, well, yes. And so you'd say, well, as to individuals, there's some very stunning ones. As to the collective, we're not too impressed. But is God undone by this? No. And that's why when we study a thing like covenant, we'll find that, I'm just using this as an example, that if you see that, you'll actually see under Jeremiah, he will actually review the kingship and rule by God directly. He'll have to talk about a new covenant, where there's an international Jerusalem world centre, and where Israel and Judah are unified. Now they've been divided. Will they all come back again? Well, yes, they will. When is that? Well, did God take them through the exile? Yes. When they got back, were they taken back? Well, no. They're still ruled by the Persians, and then Alexander follows, and then after him, and then after him, and then time Jesus comes, they're still ruled people in their own land. So what is all that about? I mean, so I'm raising an important question, which is very important for us when we come to Samuel, but you've already noticed it in Judges, isn't it? What was Judges but falling away, getting sold into God, abandoned them? And he did that quite clearly, abandoned them, sold them into the hand of King A. They cried to God, he raises up judgment. What's all that about? Does God abandon us? Well, yes. Does he keep us? Yes. Does he do both? Yes, because it's the way he actually disciplines our life. And so I'm raising an important set of questions. I'm saying that the Old Testament has much to teach us, because it teaches us about not the bustedness of people, but the way God works. And my balances are three: the significance of men and women, the sovereignty of God, and the reality of the devil. And we've already seen two important places where God actually gets involved in an evil spirit that goes and deceives someone, because they should be deceived, because they already have deceived themselves. So to people who doesn't want to hear any prophecy, if Ahab doesn't want to hear a prophet who's a true one, and he knows the true one, because he's the one he always hates, well then eventually he will fall to the storyline of the false prophets, and he does. He's deceived by his own commitment of will to wish to be, although he wouldn't have said it that way, I'm sure. So I'm raising an important question. So in my note, when two murderers bring their head to David, if you said, is this how it was meant to be? The answer is, you can't read of David's kingship and say this is the perfect and best. What you say is, here he is, judging as a governing king, and it's consistent with David's action in the past that while Saul was persecuting David, he wouldn't establish his own, so he's not going to let anybody else establish it for him either. Now, you and I have already seen that picture in 1 Corinthians when we said that where Paul had that amazing idea that you are arrogant on behalf of someone else. Remember that? So when they said, I'm of Paul, I'm of Peter, I'm of Apollos, he said, they're not singing their own song. They're humble men, but you're arrogant on their behalf. You build them up, and thus you actually compromise them, or you compromise their name in the context of the community. So this is going to be a very important thing for us to grasp, and we shall see that there's much to see now if you take this view. And that's why many Christians think that the Old Testament are there to tell us about a good moral people who are wonderful examples, till they discover that no one is. And and you still see the same issue in Christian biography. Much Christian biography is a fluff. It's a whitewash. It's written after the event when you never say anything bad about the dead, and furthermore, because people want people to be stunning Christian examples. And the answer is, why? Because actually all of us know when we've done right, and all of us know when we've done wrong. Personally speaking, do you need a whitewashed example to somehow encourage you? No, you need the reverse. You need people who actually fall over and God stays consistent with them and encourages them. They're the sorts of things that you hear from one another every day. Each of us has the ability to encourage each other, not because we say, haven't I done well, but actually by saying, hasn't God cared for me and sustained me despite how I've done? Now, isn't that more useful to you? I suspect it is. And that's what these things tell us. That God is faithful, Israel is not. Christ is faithful, his church is not. Generalisation. And when you do church history, you're seeing it in the broad, and you see that it's incredibly political. Everything's political. David's political. Well, how could a king not be political? So in other words, what happens is he actually picks it up. So I'm opening an important question because this is going to help us, particularly because it's written by a writer who has already got his own spin to tell you. As we saw, there was the writer who wrote Judges, said, this is just a time of total anarchy, where men did what was good in their own eyes. It's egalitarian and it's even, but it's disorderly. And as we saw with the Levite's concubine, this woman can be raped to death, and there's no place to get a redress. And he has to gather everybody, but nobody can sort that because it's tribal. And it falls over. And so you can't get good government in this situation. So that's one of the things we have to sort of try and understand. And we see similar things all over the world, isn't it? We're watching amazing things happening. People are sending rockets over somebody's land and they respond and they kill a lot of people. Everybody says, ooh-ah. And you think, now wait a minute, you don't have to take sides. You just say, well, they're both jammed. Are governments free of terrorist organisations who in actual fact control their situation? Well, I don't think so. Well, how would you solve this? The answer is it's not soluble. Sorry, solvable. It's not solvable. Not because there's no rights and wrongs on both sides, there's surely so, but because it's almost impossible, because not everybody is in command of their own place. And once you get a world government, then they're in real difficulty. So we have to ask, there are sets of questions that worry us, that are terrible. So it shouldn't surprise you when we come to 2 Samuel 5, we have a parallel. And so we might do the parallel first, which is 1 Chronicles 11, and the chronicler is a very different spin. 1 Chronicles 11:9 is going to give you a bit of a background. All Israel, gathered to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and your flesh." I take it that means we have history, we're family, we are one group. "In times past, even when Saul was king, you were the one who led out and brought in Israel. To lead out and bring in is the act of a
King.
shepherd."
Shepherd.
Yeah, shepherd. But a shepherd king in this case. Yes, so that David shepherded his people. "And the Lord your God said to you, you shall shepherd my people Israel, and you shall be prince over my people Israel." There's the two themes we have of prince or king and shepherd. "So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and David made a covenant with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel according to the word of the Lord through Samuel." And according to the action of Samuel as well. Although our writer doesn't choose to say that. He chooses to say that David was anointed king by the people. But it was according to Samuel's word. Just note that little shift, that little piece of editing, that piece of... There are some things when people leave them out, they matter. "Then David and all Israel went to Jerusalem," that is Jebus, "and the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, were there. And the inhabitants of Jebus said to David, you shall not enter here. Nevertheless, David captured the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David." So now we are reading a text that is well past the whole understanding of Zion. David had said, "Whoever strikes down a Jebusite first shall be chief and commander." And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, went up first, so he became chief. Now that's the explanation of this writer about how it was the case. And it was so, those things were said, and he did strike down first. But from our reading of 2 Samuel, you would have said, is Joab in a place of considerable military clout before this? I would think so. David dwelt in the stronghold, and therefore it was called the city of David. So here we understand the city takes its name by virtue of the king who inhabits it. And he built the city all around, from the Millo, we'll explain the Millo in a minute, even to the surrounding area, and Joab repaired the rest of the city. So they strengthened and fortified it. David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. That's the theology of our writer coming through. Now these are the heads of the mighty men whom David had, who gave him strong support in his kingdom. And now he begins to list the mighty men. And you'll notice that they're pretty much outsiders. Jashabim, who's a Hachemite, a chief of 30. He lifted up his spear against 300 whom he killed at one time. So now we're actually recounting their exploits. And they are in fact mighty men, but they're mighty men of war. Eleazar, the son of Dodo, the Achanite. He was with David at Pasdamim when the Philistines were gathered together to battle, and a plot was found, and there was a plot of ground full of barley, and the people fled. There's an eyewitness account. They took their stand in the midst of the plot, defended it, struck down the Philistines, and the Lord saved them by a great victory. Now 3 of the 30 men went down to the rock to David and to the cave of Adullam, and so on. And this is going to now tell you a particular story where David craved a drink, and these men broke through the camp of Philistines to get their king a drink. But he wouldn't drink it. He poured it out to the Lord because he realised it had cost too much. He said, "Be it far from me before my God that I should do this. Shall I drink the blood of these men who went at the risk of their lives? For at the risk of their lives they brought it, and therefore he would not drink it. These things the three mighty men did." And he introduces Abishai, verse 20, Benaiah, verse 22, and all these men. But you'll notice they're all foreigners. They're all from a collected bunch from outside. David has mercenaries who in actual fact he has a history with, and he has a backstory there, which is something to do prior to the time when he's established as king. This is quite important because it reveals to us something, doesn't it? When Israel comes to join with David and bring all of Israel together under one kingdom and they're one people, your understanding is the power lies in an army that's totally foreign. Now, turning back to 2 Samuel 5, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your bone and your flesh. And previously, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and in, and he said, 'You will shepherd my people.'" So you're reading material which is of a common origin or text, or the writer of Chronicles is working off the 2 Samuel text, or they have a common source. All the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them before the Lord. They anointed him. He was 30 years old when he became king. He reigned 40 years until he was 70. At Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem 33, and over all Israel and Judah. So Jerusalem is the time when he is ruling a united kingdom.
So he was anointed at 30 by Samuel?
No, by the people. Oh, pardon?
Because he was like 5 years in Hebron and here.
7.5 in Hebron.
7.5 in Hebron.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking he's too young to have done all this stuff before this point in time. No?
Well, do you mean to be 30 years by the time he's finished his Hebron rule? Do you mean that?
Yeah. Because, like, we've seen how he married this one and married that one,
Yeah.
and was in Hebron 7.5 years, and so Samuel must have anointed him king when he was like a teenager or young, early 20s or something.
Well, let's think back. If he's 30 years old when he became king, does that mean when Samuel anointed him, or when the people anointed him at Hebron? What would we think that to mean? It's just as we read the
That's my
text.
question, yeah.
Is David 30, having spent already 7.5 years in Hebron? Well, we're not told that. We're told that he actually reigned 7.5 in Hebron and 33, 40 years overall. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So if very quickly after this, and it is, verse 7, he captures the Jebusite stronghold, right? And he reigns over Judah, over the joint kingdom for 33, then we could that would be our terminus, wouldn't it? We could say at the time that he conquered Jerusalem, there are 33 more years left of his reign, and he finished at the age of 70. So it's 70 minus 33, which is 37. Right? So that now puts 7 years in Hebron. So he must have been 30 when he began reigning in Hebron.
Right.
So that gives him plenty of time, I think, Rog.
Yes, yeah, it does.
Between 18 and 30, he's been doing the southern circuit, establishing himself, running himself. That's how I think it through.
But this event of the elders
Anointing him, I think that's
post Hebron.
Well, they came to him at Hebron and he made a covenant with them there. So yes. And immediately after this, he captures Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Hence, I would say you're right. He's been there 7.5 years. When all of Israel comes to anoint him the total king. That would seem to be the way the text reads. Notice that the Jebusite city is in fact a very powerful stronghold, hard to get to. Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him reach the lame and the blind, because they actually said, the lame and the blind shall turn you away. We don't need to be strong militarily. We're in such a high-powered little nest here, you'll never get us. And therefore they say, the blind or the lame shall not come into the house. In other words, our writer of 2 Samuel explains an old expression by this particular historical setting. So David lived in the stronghold. Notice there's no real record of how that took place except that which we've known in Chronicles. But we learn that they actually went up the water shaft. If the water shaft was in fact built by then, which raises another important question, we'll come back to that. But let's read and then we'll come back. David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built all around from the Millo and inward. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord God of hosts was with him. Can you hear the chronicler text behind that? Now this is where we're up to a place that's really quite important, because in this place, in chapters 10 and on, verse 11 and on, we learn something about Hiram, king of Tyre. He sent messengers to David with cedar trees and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a house for David. You appreciate that Lebanon has got these amazing cedars, and they're clever craftsmen, they're good woodworkers, and they cut them down and they bind them together and float them down the sea to Caesarea, Asheria, and then they suck them in and draw them in on carts or rollers. The ancients used rollers to move stones and rocks and very heavy things, and so they would actually put down a road before they moved anything, which was firm, so that the rollers would roll. That's pretty much how it is. And these large... But Hiram, of course, has workers. David realised that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. So we're told that David understood that. Meanwhile, David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he'd come from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to him. And these are the names of those who were born to him, as a list. And then when the Philistines heard they had anointed David king over Israel, all the Philistines went up to seek out David, and when David heard of it, he went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines came and spread themselves out in the valley of Rephaim. And when David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand?" The Lord said, "Go up, I'll certainly give the Philistines into your hand." So David came to Baal Perazim and defeated them there, and said, "The Lord has broken through my enemies before me like the breakthrough of waters." And therefore the name is called Baal Perazim. You appreciate the word Baal means a master or a lord. So it's the Lord of the breakthrough. So that's an example of a name of a place after an event, which is all true in the whole of Israel, because there's all the names are memorials of something that happened there. They abandoned their idols there, so David and his men carried them away. Now the Philistines came up once again and spread themselves, and when David inquired of the Lord, he said, "You shall not go directly up, circle behind them and come in the front of the balsam trees. It shall be when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, you should act promptly. But then the Lord will have gone out before you to strike the army of the Philistines." This is a way of discerning the order of God's activity and conveying it to a man by a visual sign. Or in this case, a hearing sign. David did so, as the Lord had commanded him, struck down the Philistines from Geba to as far as Gezer. And then by chapter 6, he is gathering all the men of Israel, and he's got 30,000 people under under arms. Now this is quite important because when he captures Jerusalem, he makes it his capital, then you've now got a capital of both Judah and Israel, of the United Kingdom, and, well, as always united in that sense, but it's currently been a bit disunited because of the Mephibosheth, Ishbosheth civil war that's really was the work, I suspect, of the general. So now we come to understand something about this, about God as a great king. So when you come to Psalm 93, for example, you see that that psalm is going to open for us the worship of God, written after David established his throne at Jerusalem. So the tradition of the psalm's superscription tells us. Well, it doesn't in my book, but I understand it so. The Lord reigns, he is clothed with majesty, is clothed and girded himself with strength. Indeed, the world is firmly established, and it will not be moved. For your throne is established from of old, and you are from everlasting. The floods have lifted up, O Lord, have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their pounding waves, more than the sounds of many waters and the mighty breakers of the sea. The Lord on high is mighty. Your testimonies are fully confirmed. Holiness befits your house, O Lord, forevermore. This would understand that God reigns as a king, clothed in majesty. Have you ever heard of God as a king before this in the Old Testament? No, you haven't, I don't think. You've heard of his power and of his greatness, and he is a God who, he is the God who, El Shaddai, he is the great one, he is the one who looks after us. But God is a king. Now, if you think about it, what are the names of God? They're the names of God given on the basis of how he relates to us. So if you think of that, the Lord of hosts, God of Sabaoth, El Shaddai. What do you mean? What is this saying? Is it saying that God is named on the basis of how his people name him? Well, yes, because when they call him God, they call him the God who cares for us, or the God who is powerful, or the God who is mighty, or has a strong right arm, to use something from Isaiah. So what are these names of God? They're actually reflections of his actions, like saying God is God our Saviour. Is not a name for God, except that it's what he does for us. And he's our Redeemer and our Saviour and our King. So you wouldn't be at all surprised if God begins to be worshipped as a king. Not because he's named after David, that's not the issue, but because David's kingship is a form of God's government. And so God is a person who reigns and has a kingdom. So now the whole idea of a kingdom is now beginning to come forward into the discussion of Israel's relationships. You see how this is important? What God does before them, so the Exodus, for example, is, no one would doubt, I'm sure, that the Exodus is the most definitive event in the history of the Jewish people. It fits their whole understanding and sets their history from here on. They always look back and remember it, that God rescued us and made us into a people and gave us a culture and gave us our rules and our laws and our worship and everything, really. And then promised us a land, and then took us into that land, and then we thought, we'll live here happily ever after. And that's not the case. It falls over. And then when David becomes king and the kingdom and the kingship is established, and the Philistines are absolutely at their outside, and they're safe and secure, that falls over as well. And then by the time of the exile, the whole kingdom of David has gone down the chute. entirely, and the people are taken back to slavery because God has abandoned them and sent them off. And the message, isn't it, of God to us, to Jeremiah is, tell these people when the Babylonians come, you should give up. People who will survive go to Babylon. And they said, you're a treasonous prophet. You are no good, my boy. And they put him in a pit and did all sorts of things to him. And Jeremiah saying, no, it's the word of the Lord. The future is in the people who go to Babylon. It's not in the people who get saved here. And then they come back from Babylon. And they've written all these psalms. By the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept. How can we sing a song for God when we're not in Zion? Now what's that telling you? If you're not in Zion, you can't sing a song in Babylon. Well, you're not in Zion. That's the whole point. You're in Babylon. Can you worship God in Babylon? Yes, they find out they can. The synagogue grows up. They come back and then they revert. They rebuild the city and the walls. And then Ezra and Nehemiah take them back to law. And you think, going back to Exodus, because they can't work it out. What's God doing? We thought he was bringing us back, saving us. And the answer is, he did. But we're still occupied. We're not free. That's all it's about. So the peak is David. When the coming of Jesus, he is seen as he is seen as the son of David. And two blind men say, Son of David, have mercy upon us. And so the peak of David's reign and the peak of Jesus coming up to two peaks. There's been dissolution halfway through. So this waxing and waning of God's people. So if you said to the Jewish people, how do you know that God is with you? The answer is because we've had a terrible time and he's always rescued us. Yes, but was he tough on you? Yes, he was. Now, is that your experience? Of course. When we're stupid, does God abandon us? Well, no. Does it seem like he has? Yes. But does he pick us up again and refresh us and bring us back and renew us? Yes, he does. So these are themes we want in our hands. Otherwise, we'll be in a fairly, we'll be in a cynical place here because we'll see that nothing seems to work properly. So in the Psalms, you won't be surprised that when they start to talk to God, they're free to complain. I mean, do you complain to God? Indeed. Diane complains to God. Now, why can you complain to God? Well, not because you're actually always rebelliously challenging him, but because you actually I don't understand this. You're supposed to be for me. So if you're for me, this doesn't look too good as if it's coming to me. The answer is, well, he is for us. But he has to live with our recalcitrant rudeness and stupidity and self-centeredness and the fact that it's got to be about me. And he says, no, it's not. And and if it's not going to be about me, well, then it'll be about him. But if it is, how will he convince us of that? Will he just bash us over the head and destroy us? Well, never. So what does he do? Well, he does that too. But the thing is that he does that to a sample, so everybody else gets the message. But so what do can you see where I'm heading here? This is very, very important because we're at the peak. We're coming to the peak of the kingdom. But actually you'll see it ends in a rebellion of Absalom. It comes down. It disintegrates David's family. And Solomon comes to reign not by anointing. It's how Solomon got to be king is itself instructive. And he loses it all. It's just amazing. It's almost like, a generation that doesn't fight for it loses it. That's just the way it goes. So, we have God worshipped as a king. Now I just want to... No, I won't do that. We should take a break and stop. Because Psalm 2 is our next one, and that's a very beautiful and fruitful psalm. Now we're heading to Psalm 2, Psalm 110, 1 Chronicles 12, and then back to 2 Samuel 5, where Hiram sends material for the house, and of course David has an immediate idea. I think I'll build a house for the Lord. And God says it's a good idea, but you won't do it. You're a man of war. You're a bloody individual. Don't you build in my house? Which says a lot of things itself. Now, I just want to remind you of a couple of things. We have come through Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, and the whole issue has been about one thing. You've entered the land and you haven't got rid of the people in the land. Well, David does that and finishes that job. The Philistines are there no longer, and they're the major military might. Others are small skirmishes in valleys here and towns there, but Philistines are a major game. And David defeats the Philistines. So I don't think you'd be wrong if you understood that David is a man after God's own heart, is that at the entry to the promised land, they never captured it, but David finished it. In other words, he brought it to a conclusion by an enormous shedding of blood and by a major series of battles. And he doesn't establish the house of the Lord. Someone else will do that, but God gives his dynasty a promise. We'll come to that. So tonight's a bit of a, you might think it's a bit of a mishmash, but actually it's really important because we're beginning to see that the Old Testament is highly instructive about many things. Later when we come to the, and what we're dealing with a theology of narrative. We're getting our theology from the story. Later we shall see as the Jewish canon fixes itself, there will be the wisdom literature. And once we get to Job, we'll start to see that this is a story like Esther or like Ruth. We don't know if Ruth was real or not, but we do. It's the last verse, isn't it? That Ruth and Naomi are in the line of David. So it's going to be important for us to actually try and understand how shall we learn through wisdom. When you come to the wisdom literature, what you'll see is it's the same sort of thing. It's about ambiguities. It's about the loose woman, who we should be warned about. Now, if you live in a village where everybody's married and you've got an unmarried girl, unmarried woman particularly, well then she's dangerous. Well, not because she's terrible herself, but because she constitutes a difficulty to the community. How shall we deal with her? Important problem. Proverbs will spend a lot of time on that. And then there's all sorts of things about doing things at the right time. Ecclesiastes. Understanding insight and wisdom. What is wisdom? And so those questions will start to be taking... But you know what they'll always do? They'll always take shape against the ambiguity of life. How do you live in a naughty world? Fundamentally. Because people are awful and wicked, and you need to be wise. And you need to not meet with these people. You think, what's all that about? So the Old Testament is full of this. And we need to see, so is the New Testament for that matter. Got any questions about this? We're going slowly, but we're about to speed up with some degree of speed. Yeah. By the way, this is all going to be about Zion, kingdom, and worship. David establishes worship and orders it and puts it in order, as kings do. Sorry.
Modern day Zionism, do you have some information in your library on how that differs from this godly kingdom that David has set up in the beginning? It would be different now? A political push, not necessarily what the Lord is doing. There's something I've never understood. So
I don't think I do either. Theodor Herzl was in 1904 Theodor Herzl was a journalist who was in Paris, and he saw the Dreyfus affair, where that Jewish man was fired out of France, and he was appalled. And he called together a lot of people to ask the question, why should this happen? And particularly in an enlightened land like France, which at that time it probably was in some ways. France has changed a lot. And so he gathered together people and expressed his desire that there should be a homeland for Jewish people to go to. But he was such an intense dude, he made a big impact. And so the Zionistic drive arises out of Theodor Herzl in 1904.
Homeland.
And the Homeland Drive. And then, do you remember that, well, throughout the whole of the 18th and 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, there was a whole handling of Jewish people in Poland, where they were put beyond the Pale. The Pale was a corridor between Danzig and the mountains, and the Jews were confined to this corridor, which, of course, Hitler overran very quickly and took out vast numbers of Jewish people from what would be mid and northern Poland. And so after the war, when the British people, Lord Balfour, made a declaration which welcomed Jews, and he expressed a wish that they would have a homeland. At that time, the British were in control of the Middle East. And so they set the borders of current Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and something else. And they set those borders arbitrarily according to British interests, which were just British interests, ours. But things took a sticky wicket when the British were driven out. And so in 1948, with that enormous number of people which the story of the Exodus, the ship. So I'm thinking it goes something like that. I think that Theodor Herzl's idea took root, and then once the Nazis phenomenon took place, people were so appalled. Their question was, there's got to be a place where people can just settle down and more importantly, establish themselves and more importantly, defend themselves. Now, is that of God? I think it's hard to say what's of God and what isn't in Israel, because if anything the Old Testament teaches us is that God is quite happy to accommodate. When I say quite happy, God is able in his freedom. This is Karl Barth's great theme, God is free. We misjudge his freedom. We think he could never do that. You know, we're like Habakkuk saying, how can you use these wicked Assyrians to punish us? They're dreadful people, just dreadful. And, and he's saying that to God, and what God is saying is, no, I'm free to do that. So what does the Holocaust mean? That's been such a terrible question which people have had such difficulty trying to understand. Tom Torrance has had a lot to say about that. But he has a particular spin on the scapegoat question. I don't know the answer to your question because I don't know that I know. No, I don't know that I'm understanding. I don't think you can say what is of God and what is not today too much, because if the Old Testament teaches you anything, you learn that God has ways of working it out, but it's always in this amalgam of ambitious people, drivey, pushy people, wicked people, occult matters, and God himself. And you're always left after the event saying, isn't he brilliant? He establishes he brings about his revelation within this amalgam. But it's just the amalgam that makes it right, because That's why he's a God to trust. Because even when people are terrible and rude and awful and all those things in the Psalms, if the wicked should prosper, God is still sovereign. But it's hard to see from our purview. It's not from his, and certainly not over 2 millennia. I don't know the answer to that.
What about the Palestinians too, isn't it? If David killed the Philistines, that's the sort of thing that I always, but they really, it was called, that area was called Palestine, but it was sort of a region, it wasn't.
Yes, it was a geographical region more than it was a national issue. Yes, that's right.
There was Arabs, Jews, Christians, and all others living there.
And when you read books like 20th century Reader in Jerusalem, 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 that particular volume, I have it over there probably. That's just a history of the occupation since the time. And I mean, there are places, aren't there, where God delivered, didn't he? I mean, the Golan Heights, the 67 war was just miraculous, utterly miraculous. The 1949, you know, when people, I mean, when the Arabian people said they've given them the basis to be a nation, we're going to kill this right now. It's got to go. We've got to do it right now. They're going to establish themselves. So they did, and then Israel cobbled together, you know, fighter aircraft from bits and pieces, tanks that were 1 or 2 or 3 they pinched from them, British, and they got onto the Golan Heights and then discovered that they were essentially angels. They just defeated a phenomenally big force, and the Jews themselves understood this is miraculous. It's not us. We're not clever. So I don't know. It's not easy. You see God caring for his people, but does that mean he approves of their statehood? Has he commended lands and blessed lands where Jews have gone, specifically the United States? Yes, they made a home for the Jewish people. But even then, it's not comfortable for them. They're politically very active. They drive American politics at certain levels, not always, but then so does the crazy Christian right. So this is what helps me when I read this stuff. I say, the sovereignty of God to me is something that you know when everything else looks like it isn't. When God doesn't look too sovereign, that's because we must take seriously he engages with us. Is God sovereign in your life? Do you do whatever you want to do? Yes. Is that right? No. But despite all that we do that's our own stuff and our own ambitions and drives and the things we want, does God manage to care for us and establish his sovereignty over our lives? He does. So that we want it. And in the end, we give up on the agendas and basically say, well, we really would like to do whatever you would like done today. When we get to that place, the power starts to fall. And I think that, I just think that's right, isn't it? So if we look at the church and say it's a bit of a mess, isn't it? And it's very ambitious and very sort of, health and wealth driven and basically self-referred and success driven and looking great and aren't we all fabulous? We say this can't be right. This is dreadful. But can God work through it? He does. He does. And you think, how does he do that? So he seems to bless people he shouldn't, in our view. The answer is he blesses us all, but in different ways. But in a way that he has a way to undo things as well. He can undo as well as do. So we're into something big here, of which the Old Testament opens for us the story. So when the Jewish people say, well, what is it all about for us? Who are we? We just seem to suffer all the time. The answer is, look at your history. Do you think God is holding you? They'd say, well, not right now. You'd say, no, over the long view, do you think that's the case? Of course, that's what the Old Testament tells us. But the same would be true for Christians who lose their lives like crazy, and others who, just are political animals who mess up everything. Let's take a coffee break.